This program contains vivid scenes of military combat that may be disturbing for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. Parts of this story are dramatized, with special attention given to historical accuracy.
It was a raid that was supposed to last for 30 minutes. Then an American Black Hawk helicopter was shot down, and the entire mission changed.
There's a city of people out there wanting to kill us.
It turned into the biggest American firefight since the war in Vietnam.
You could feel in the air this seething sensation of people wanting to kill you.
I can't go back out of that city. I'm gonna die tonight.
He just didn't want to hear anyone scream anymore.
The Battle of Mogadishu would alter the course of American foreign policy.
We all reacted with anger and horror as an armed Somali gang desecrated the bodies of our American soldiers.
And forever change American history. October 4th, 1993. America awakens to images of horror.
My fellow Americans, today I want to talk with you about our nation's military involvement in Somalia.
Like most Americans, I was obviously really shocked and confused. I had to be able to answer that question that occurred to me when I first saw those pictures of the dead Americans being dragged through the streets, and that was, how did the Somalis gone from being, the grateful recipient of international aid to, an army at war with American soldiers, angry to the extent of not just killing them, but, dragging their bodies through the streets.
Author Mark Bowden's search for answers would result in the 1999 bestseller Black Hawk Down. To write it, he would have to visit a country in Africa, considered one of the most dangerous places on Earth.
I came to the reluctant conclusion that really the only way to tell this story well would be to go to Somalia. And the idea, was frightening to me to go there, frankly. So I began by calling the State Department, and I said, I'm planning to go to Somalia. Can you give me any advice? And he says, yeah, I'll give you some advice. Don't go.
With no government and no laws, Somalia remains a country in name only. Months after the tragic incident, Bowden would place his life in the hands of the very militias who desecrated American soldiers.
The city of Mogadishu, as we approached it, looked like it had been trampled by giants. It's a city where there were few structures intact. Things had not just been destroyed, they were like pulverized. Roads strewn with trash and debris and blown-up cars. Nearly every major structure has been destroyed. The few exceptions to that are mosques with their minarets. And it's because Islam is really the only thing in Somalia and Mogadishu that's held sacred. One of the most frightening things in the world is a 10-year-old with an automatic rifle. And you see a lot of that in Mogadishu. Virtually every male is armed. The most appropriate line about Mogadishu that I'd ever read was that everything that guns can accomplish has been accomplished in Mogadishu. And I just saw the truth of that.
Gripped by famine, Mogadishu's greatest hope arrives in 1992. The United Nations focuses its relief efforts on the drought-stricken Horn of Africa. For the first time in modern history, the world shows it cares about the suffering people of Somalia.
The factional fighting in Somalia had gotten so bad that huge numbers of people were starving to death.
No food, no peace, just everywhere is violence.
Both the civilian side of the Bush administration and the military side concluded that there was no other way to get the help there except to use the U.S. military.
President George Bush Sr. Intervened in 1992 at the urging of the UN to end the famine in Somalia. And toward that end, 20,000 United States Marines landed on the beaches of Mogadishu in December, to be greeted by hundreds of photographers from around the world who photographed and videotaped their struggling up on the beach.
Under Operation Restore Hope, the mission of the U.S. Marines is to ensure the distribution of food to the desperate Somalis. Shipments intended for the starving are being seized by gunmen loyal to Somalia's rival clan warlords. The most formidable of these warlords is Mohammed Farah Aidid.
He was one of those who was actively involved in seizing international food shipments so that he could feed his gunmen before starving children were fed in the interior of the city. He was a person with a tremendous amount of power and savvy. He was also ruthless. He used violence, obviously, against his enemies, but even to keep his own clan in line. He didn't shrink from using starvation as a weapon against his enemies.
Among the American soldiers bringing aid to the starving is the warlord's own son.
I came back to Somalia 8 December 1992.
Sent to America for his education, Hussein Aidid had become a U.S. citizen and joined the military.
I was proud to be a U.S. Marine with my best friends. I served very well and I received 2 medals.
Over the next few weeks, the Marines succeeded in opening up all of the truck routes and warehouses and delivering food, and basically ended the famine in Somalia.
And we delivered the needed assistance very quickly and saved millions of Somalis. And we all felt proud.
With the famine alleviated, the U.S. Marines are replaced by a multinational United Nations peacekeeping force.
And it was at that point then that efforts were made to form a cooperative coalition government amongst the warlords who had been fighting with each other, so that when these military forces were withdrawn, the situation wouldn't just deteriorate again into famine. The problem was that almost all of the warlords were eager to cooperate in this coalition, except for the most powerful of them, Mohammed Farah Aidid, who had designs on ruling Somalia. So for him to agree to cooperate with people who he expected to defeat was something that he had no intention of doing. Basically, he laid low through the period when there was this huge military presence in Mogadishu, but literally the day in the spring of 1993 when the Marines were withdrawn, Aidid launched an offensive against his enemies and also began sniping and setting off mines, killing UN peacekeepers. So Aidid, over the course of the spring and early summer of 1993, managed to become an outlaw.
It appeared that if we could cut the head off the political side and the military side of Aidid's forces, then we could bring harmony to the city.
In their initial efforts to catch Aidid, the UN launched a number of raids into the city that resulted in a large number of Somalis being killed. So during the course of that summer, as the UN was pursuing Aidid, they were gradually turning the people of Mogadishu against the UN intervention.
When they first came, we were very, very happy. The UN and the Americans were helping people. The problem started when they started to go after Aidid.
The Americans were interfering in the affairs of the Somali people.
The helicopters would come in low over our houses, terrifying the children.
It was a United Nations operation, but we knew that the executive power behind it was obviously the United States.
The same effort, the same mission that had been received with open arms in December of 1992 began to be perceived as an invasion, as a foreign invasion, particularly among the followers of Mohammed Farah Aidid.
With hostilities against America growing in Somalia, the U.S. military begins preparing its special forces at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Turn to your left, fire double tap.
In a mission codenamed Gothic Serpent, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and Air Force Commandos begin joint training for a potential showdown with Aidid.
Once I get to Fort Bragg, then I get a better understanding what the actual mission statement was.
UN food shipments were getting hit, and basically the guy responsible for it was Aidid.
Our objective there was to go and capture Mohammed Farah Aidid and also dismantle as much of his key infrastructure as possible.
Training alongside the Special Forces is America's premier combat team, a top-secret unit known as Delta Force.
A unit that's so secret the Army doesn't acknowledge its existence.
I'm not really sure what I'm allowed to say about them, actually.
The existence of Delta is neither confirmed nor denied by the American government.
As a former Delta operator, Wayne Long was well aware of the capabilities of Delta Force.
It is a force which is given special operations tasks over and above Special Forces, over and above the Rangers.
Lee Van Arsdale spent 11 years as one of America's secret warriors.
We have a group of individuals, fairly small by military standards, that are specially selected and trained to do the jobs they do. Going much beyond that, I'm going to go into classified territory, which we won't do.
What they specialize in is targeting individuals and finding them and arresting them.
They're really absolutely the best shooters and assaulters in the world, bar none.
To support the Delta mission, the U.S. turns to a select unit of Army combat helicopter pilots.
The Night Stalkers are the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment out of Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and they are the hottest helicopter pilots in the world.
Night Stalker pilot Mike Durant is a veteran of global combat missions.
And this was considered what's called a low-intensity conflict. We're not going against the Iraqi integrated air defense system. We're going against basically individuals with weapons, whatever they can carry or put on a vehicle.
As Task Force Ranger trains in America, Aidid rallies the city of Mogadishu in opposition to the UN peacekeeping mission.
Well, the average Somali doesn't read the New York Times every day and doesn't watch CNN. They know what they're told, for the most part. And Aidid was a fairly sophisticated propaganda master. The broadcast from the radio station would tell people that the Americans were in Mogadishu to force everyone to convert to Christianity, to steal their firstborn children, whatever. But it didn't take a lot to add to the general hostility about what was going on, a fear that the Americans were here to really do serious harm to people of that city. His real conflict with the UN came to a head on June 5th of 1993, when UN forces went and did a surprise inspection of the Aidid clan's radio station, which prompted a kind of spontaneous uprising, which led to 24 Pakistani soldiers being killed as part of this patrol, and their bodies were mutilated.
At that point, the Security Council passed a resolution saying get those responsible. Admiral Howe, the Secretary General, Special Representative, posted a notice saying $25,000 reward for Aidid. From then on, it was get Aidid.
Well, this was regarded as an insult by the Somalis, who promptly put a $250,000 bounty on the head of Animal Howe, as they called him.
Admiral Howe requests the deployment of Delta to apprehend Aidid.
So help me God.
Though the request is turned down by the new Clinton administration, Task Force Ranger continues to prepare for a showdown with Aidid.
We received a lot of information before deploying to Somalia about specifically the fighters in the country, those people that would be behind the weapons, pulling a trigger.
Mogadishu has become one of the great arms markets of East Africa.
If it launched a bullet or exploded, they had it in Somalia.
The heavily armed militias of Somalia are known as the Morian.
Morian are young Somali gunmen who basically are recruited from refugee camps and from the countryside, who have really nothing to do and no way to make a living.
These were generally young men who were recruited and trained by the drug market in Somalia. The drug of the country was a drug that was referred to as khat. Generally, the warlords controlled the drug going into the city. And the warlords handed the drug out free to anybody who would be willing to handle a gun. And so the fighters in the city were men that were paid for by drugs. It was a drug much along the lines of cocaine, and it gave the soldiers there a bit of courage that they wouldn't have had without the drug. They would use the drug, and then about an hour or two later, the drug would hit full potency, and they would become very aggressive.
They cruise around in technicals, they're heavily armed, and they're ready to fight against each other, or in this case, against Americans at a moment's notice.
By late summer of 1993, the Morion begin directly targeting American soldiers who are part of the UN peacekeeping force.
Americans are being killed, 2 here, 2 there.
On August 8th, Aidid's Morion target a U.S. Army vehicle with a command-detonated mine. 4 American soldiers are killed. In the first military decision of his administration, President Clinton orders the immediate deployment of Task Force Ranger to Somalia.
We were left with no other option as a nation trying to take the lead in Somalia, but to deploy our troops there and our cutting-edge troops, the best people we had to actually track down a single man in a city of 1 million people and bring him in. And we were going to get him.
When a 1993 attack on UN peacekeepers by Somali warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid kills 4 American soldiers, President Clinton authorizes the deployment of special forces to Somalia.
In late August of 1993, Task Force Ranger, which was made up of Delta Force, and these Rangers arrived in Mogadishu.
Under the command of General William Garrison, Task Force Ranger occupies the old Mogadishu airport, just south of the city. Unlike the Marines who preceded them, this is not a humanitarian mission.
The mission was to apprehend Mohammed Farah Aidid. It had nothing to do with feeding people or distributing rice or anything else.
Even the veteran soldiers are shocked by what they see in Mogadishu.
Everyone's armed, everyone's got some RPGs. Frankly, going out and getting in firefights in the street is something that they all do, so they're remarkable fighters. I mean, they've been doing it for generations now, and it's almost like it's their national pastime. You compare them to some of the other places in the world you go, and people can't wait to throw their arms in the air, but Somalis have no quit in them. They almost live to fight, and that's women and children as well.
They conducted over the month of September 6 different raids out in the city. Initially, they had some problems.
You can't go out and do a tiger hunt and beat the bush and drive them out to you, especially when you're talking about a very powerful warlord in his own backyard.
In the city of Mogadishu, they had Somali spies, sort of traditional human intelligence.
When Aidid became a wanted man by the UN, of course they couldn't even find him.
Inadvertently, they arrested 9 UN workers who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there were embarrassing missteps, but they also began to have successes toward the end of September. They raided a convoy of cars and arrested Osman Otto, who was Aidid's chief financier and sort of weapons purchaser. And it sort of confirmed that their intelligence and their tactics were finally paying off. And of course, there was a tremendous amount of resentment. Imagine if some foreign power, swooped into your little suburban neighborhood of Denver or Baltimore or Washington and at gunpoint started arresting your community leaders. In short order, everybody who had a rifle would be in the streets to shoot at them when they came down, which is precisely what happened in Mogadishu.
When the Americans first came, they were very popular. Everybody, and I mean everybody, was very supportive of them.
People decided to kill any American or any United Nations officer because we believed that when Aidid was killed, the rest of Somalia would be killed.
When we very first got there, it didn't seem like they were the enemy. That's an accurate term in this case. They became the enemy for us.
Months before Task Force Ranger arrived in Mogadishu, an event had occurred that helped Aidid galvanize Somali hostilities toward the American forces. The UN received word of a large Somali gathering at the compound of Abdi Quibdid.
Abdi Quibdid was a political advisor to Mohammed Farah Aidid.
I was Interior Minister for General Aidid. We were meeting to discuss our situation with the American forces.
Present at this meeting were all of the intellectuals and elders of the Haber-Gider clan, some of whom were opposed to the militant posture that Aidid had taken against the UN.
They were actually meeting there to try and get Aidid to comply with all UN and US demands. And Aidid was in a bind.
They were hashing out what to do about their relationship with the UN when a number of Cobra helicopters from the UN peacekeeping force surrounded the building from the air and began pumping tow missiles into it, killing 50 to 70 people, basically slaughtering them.
The American helicopters kept shelling and shelling the house, killing everyone.
UN human rights officer at the time called it a cold-blooded murder.
From that day forward, the Haber-Gider clan, including many of the people who had been opposed to Aidid's posture against the UN, were now basically at war against the UN and the United States.
I was horrified, because if you know anything about the Somalis, you know what it means. They're just going to fight to the last man to get their revenge.
With intelligence unable to locate Aidid in the hostile city, Task Force Ranger begins targeting Aidid's closest advisors, called Tier 1 personalities.
Two of these Tier 1 personalities were Omar Salad and Hassan Awale. Both of them were spotted at a rally in Mogadishu on Sunday, October 3rd, and were followed from this rally back to a house in central Mogadishu near the Olympic Hotel in the Bakara Market. And so a decision was made once the intelligence confirmed that they were at that location to launch a raid to try and arrest them.
It was very, very good intel. The guys were there. Let's go pick them up.
Sunday, 2:49 p.m. Aidid's lieutenants are spotted entering a residence near central Mogadishu. Delta commanders retreat to the Joint Operations Command Center, or JOC, to formulate a plan. Delta Force will insert directly to the target building via MH-6 Little Bird helicopters. While Delta operators arrest the prisoners, 4 teams of Rangers, known as Chalks, will fast rope to the ground from Blackhawks and provide perimeter security for Delta. The Blackhawks will then serve as air support above the target house. A convoy of 12 vehicles, already en route to the target building, will evacuate all soldiers and prisoners back to the Ranger base.
They figured if it took more than a half hour, they were going to run into serious trouble.
Everything is speed-oriented on one of these, because obviously if you're trying to get somebody, they're not going to remain static for long.
By now, the young men in particular of Task Force Ranger, the Rangers, were pretty cocky about these missions.
I think we all had this Superman mentality.
I felt almost as if we were so overpowering that the Somalis couldn't touch us.
But this time, the Rangers are heading into a very different situation.
The house that Omar Salad and Hassan Awale retreated to was in one of the worst neighborhoods in Mogadishu as far as the Americans were concerned. It was Aidid's stronghold neighborhood, so there was a lot of armed gunmen there. It was just blocks away from the Bakara Market, which is one of the largest arms markets in that part of the world. They also tended to work at night. They'd done half of their missions anyway at night, and it was always more dangerous to go out during the daytime.
The daylight raid will pit the Americans against Aidid's Morion in the midst of their narcotic cot cycle.
And they tend to begin sort of socially chewing this drug early in the afternoon, so that by mid-afternoon they are probably at their most agitated, active state. But because there were 2 of these primary targets at the same location. It was a very juicy opportunity.
We knew we were going into what they called Indian territory. We knew it was really not a great part of town for us to be in. We weren't real popular.
Garrison was aware of how dangerous the Bakara Market neighborhood was. In writing about it in a letter some days before, he'd actually said that there are places in the city where we could go where we will win the battle, but we could end up losing the war.
October 3rd, 1993. The men of Task Force Ranger are enjoying a rare day off in Mogadishu.
The call came at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon for them to what they called kit up, which was to get dressed up because they were going out on a mission.
We got the word to go. Get it on.
Threw on all the armor and, you know, ammo and everything.
You know, everyone had all their gear ready, always.
Everybody was on the aircraft, everybody was on the vehicles, the engines were running, the rotors were turning, we were just waiting for the word.
The code word for the launching the mission was Irene, and Irene was announced at 3:30 on October 3rd, Sunday afternoon. A force of about 19 Black Hawk helicopters and Little Birds took off from the hangar on the airbase in Mogadishu and headed out over the Indian Ocean.
We went out around the city, came in hard and fast like we always do, and without a doubt we were going in.
Once over the site, Delta Force operators hit the ground, jumped off of the benches of the Little Bird helicopters right in front of the target building and raided it and successfully arrested Omar Salat and Hassan Awali, their two targets for that raid, along with about 20 other Somalis who were in the house.
It went like clockwork initially. The assault force was inserted. We kept snipers orbiting above and the Hawks providing surgical cover fire.
While they were arresting them, Rangers began roping down from Black Hawk helicopters to four corners around that target block.
I just remember it was so high up.
It seemed like I was on that rope forever until I hit the ground.
And the games began. I mean, it was pretty fast, and the civilians that were in the areas moving in towards us.
I got down there and it was just total, you know, I felt it. I felt panic.
This time we were still getting on the ground and they were already shooting at us.
It wasn't this huge volume of fire, but well-placed rounds.
You don't know how you're going to react when that first bullet sings by your head or the first guy comes out in front of you, what you're going to do.
After that, I guess, is when everything started to go south.
As soon as the task force launched the raid or hit the ground, the alarm was sounded throughout the city. One of the things that the Somalis would do is set tires on fire, which would serve as a signal for people from far away to come to that spot.
And our population here, as usual, everybody took his gun.
I could see from a distance where they were dropping in from helicopters near the Olympic Hotel, so I immediately rushed the area.
We were patrolling in our technicals when we were ordered to the fight.
From our point of view, we were provoked to fight. We had no choice but to defend ourselves.
So from the minute the Rangers and the Delta Force operators hit the ground, the forces opposed to them were massing and growing in number as every minute went by.
As the Rangers fast rope in, the ground convoy races to the target building as planned.
I started to see right away that there was more gunfire there than on any of the previous missions.
We started taking small arms fire. It was more accurate already, and there was more volume.
We could tell that someone was waiting for us. Someone was ready. Well, when I turned the corner, we were already shooting. There's a couple of guys in a doorway shooting, and they were pretty brazen. They were right there, and they were shot down. Seeing those first two guys, I knew that people were definitely dying in this mission, and it was going to be up close and personal.
As the ground convoy fights its way to the objective, a Ranger is already down just north of the target building.
One of the first things that went wrong was that one of the young Rangers, a Ranger named Todd Blackburn, missed the rope as he went out the helicopter and plummeted 70 feet to the street.
I turned around, I saw my best friend, Todd Blackburn, just sitting lifeless on the ground. He just had his eyes rolled back and his kappa was off. I didn't know to what extent, how much enemy was out there. All I knew was somebody was firing at us. And I remember turning around and seeing Galentine. One minute he's firing down the road, and the next minute I just see bright red. And I was like, oh my Lord, I mean, he just got shot. He's saying my thumb's blown off, it's gone. He was definitely going into shock.
And it just went on from there. They stayed back, they got high, worked their windows, their doorways, you know, everything they had to put rounds onto us.
Literally everyone came to the firefight. That included women and children, all armed, huge numbers of weapons, lots of ammunition, and it was a huge volume of fire. A bigger firefight than I saw in my 4 tours in Vietnam.
Well, I mean, left and right, within 30 minutes, it was half of Sergeant Eversman's squad was, you know, dropping like flies. And at that point, you know, the fear kicked in. Okay, we're sitting here, what do we do now? And that's when the convoy came.
With the prisoners in the custody of Delta, the ground convoy arrives and begins driving back the Somalis with their .50 caliber turret guns.
We were able to engage those targets from a much farther distance than the Rangers on the ground.
It's like a God sent to heaven. And that was the feeling of hearing a .50 cal just going off, knowing that whoever's in there is not going to get us.
And they began trying to make arrangements by calling off on the radio to have Todd Blackburn immediately evacuated, because their medical assessment was that he wasn't going to survive unless they got him back to a doctor real fast.
Jeff Struker is ordered to immediately evacuate Todd Blackburn to the base.
We loaded Todd Blackburn in the middle Humvee, in the cargo Humvee, with absolutely no protection around him. I led this 3-vehicle convoy out of the target building. As soon as I made that turn on the main road, we got hit from every direction. PFC Paulson was swinging his .50 cal in every direction, just trying to shoot back in 50 directions at once. So I shouted to Paulson and to Pilla, Paulson, turn your gun to the left. Pilla, you take everything to the right. The next intersection that we hit, there was a man, a Somalian, with an AK-47 within 8 feet of our vehicle. He pointed it at Paulson's back. He was going to shoot Paulson. Dominic Pilla saw him point that weapon at Paulson. That guy saw Dominic Pilla with his machine gun pointed at him. And they looked at each other eye to eye, and then they both fired. And both people dropped dead. Pilla was shot in the head. He fell over into the lap of Specialist Monahan. At that same moment, my platoon sergeant called me on the radio. And he said, hey, Sergeant Struker, what's going on? Where are you? And I said, I've got one guy who's hit, and he's down. And at this time on the radio, there's 100 other people talking, having 100 different conversations at the same time. All of it's going on in the background. So he called me again and he said, who is it and what's his status? And I didn't want to say it because I knew the effect that it was going to have. I paused for a minute. I said, it's Pilla, and he's dead. And as soon as I said that, every conversation on the radio ceased. And there was silence for about 30 seconds. And I realized that I had just told everybody in the operation that we had just taken our first casualty. We had just lost our first soldier.
The so-called invincibility of the Ranger force had been breached in a really terrible way, and I think it sent a real shock up and down all of their spines.
It's Sunday, 3:45 p.m. Task Force Rangers' assault to capture lieutenants of Somali warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid is met with much greater resistance than ever imagined.
We all fought against the Americans. Women, children, our militia, everyone.
You know, the Habergator clan turned out to have a much bigger militia than what we thought, what we'd been told up until that time.
The Americans also underestimated the level of experience the Somalis had as fighters. They may have seen them as primitives, but in fact, the average Somali gunman had a lot more experience with combat than any of the Rangers or even the Delta Force operators. This is a country that had been at civil war for 5 to 6 years, so, you know, the American soldiers were rookies.
Whether with weapons or with your bare hands, a fight is a fight, and we belong to this fight. This was our territory.
Aidid's biggest weapon was to tell his people, just kill one American and they will go away. Yeah, it was a belief by every Somali that the Americans were afraid to die.
So they were willing to die, if necessary, in large numbers in order to kill an American.
After 6 previous raids by Task Force Ranger, Aidid had come up with a strategy to counter the superior force.
Helicopters tended to fly, a few of them in an orbit around the area where they were working and provide air cover. And the belief was that if they could shoot down one of those helicopters, they could force the Americans to stay put. They would basically trap them in one spot because they knew they wouldn't abandon the crew of the downed helicopters.
We went on top of the buildings to get a good shot at the helicopters. We used RPGs.
RPGs are basically hand grenades. They're just like hand grenades, but they're mounted on a little rocket with fins, and they're projected from an elongated tube. And rocket-propelled grenades are cheap, so there were a lot of them in Mogadishu, and so they were able to shoot literally hundreds of these rocket-propelled grenades into the air, and it was probably inevitable that at some point one of the Black Hawks circling overhead was going to collide with one of these grenades.
It was very simple. The helicopters were so close, you could even hit them with the AK-47s.
Despite the ferocity of the firefight, the early stages of the raid go as planned.
30 minutes into the raid, the prisoners had all been rounded up and flex-cuffed with plastic handcuffs, and were being loaded on vehicles out in front of the target house. Dom Pilla was already dead. He was on the convoy of 3 Humvees that was evacuating Todd Blackburn. Rangers were all getting instructions that were all expecting to be loading on the convoy and driving out of the city at any moment.
We were done, essentially, unless something came up, and obviously something did come up.
They were under increasingly heavy fire when suddenly the men looked up and saw an explosion on the tail rotor of one of the Black Hawk helicopters.
Black Hawk Super 6-1, piloted by Cliff Walcott, is struck by an RPG.
And Cliff made the call that they had been hit and that they were going down.
I looked over between 2 buildings and I could see it slowly starting to rotate out.
And you could see the helicopter just sort of, lose that thrust from the tail rotor and start spinning around, and I lost it behind the buildings.
They watched with horror as this helicopter clipped the top of a building about 6 blocks away and crashed.
General Garrison said it very succinctly: we just lost the initiative, and that's exactly what it is. You go in with speed and surprise, and you go out the same way, you win. But getting a helicopter shot down, we simply lost the initiative.
That changed the mission, of course, from an assault to a rescue operation.
We had already seen what the Somalis did to dead Americans or dead Pakistanis, and no one was going to stand by and let our mates be drugged through the streets if we could have anything to do about it.
So people began reversing direction and converging on that crashed helicopter. The commanders back at the jock had a camera move right over top of where that Black Hawk had crashed. So it was obvious, number one, they had wounded living American soldiers on the ground, vastly outnumbered, and if they didn't get help to them right away, they were going to be slaughtered.
As ground troops begin racing to the crash site, a chopper drops in low.
A Little Bird helicopter flown by Carl Mayer and Keith Jones made a daring rescue.
While one of the pilots holds the bird in place and leans out shooting his MP5, a 9mm submachine gun, the other one hops out and helps get Dan Bush with Jim Smith over into the back of the helo. It's simply amazing heroism.
Moments after the Little Bird rescue, a combat search and rescue team begins roping in near the wreckage.
So we had, in very short order, 30-some American soldiers protecting that crash site.
Loaded with prisoners and prepared to drive out of the city, The ground convoy is ordered to make its way to the crash site.
Once that Black Hawk crashed, it was the moment that Mohammed Farah Aidid had been waiting for all those weeks, because he had prepared his militias to set up roadblocks throughout the city, because he knew that once the Black Hawk was down, the United States would have to try to rescue the members of their team.
And that's what started really what was the worst part of the operation. Most of the casualties from that day came from the vehicle convoy, because we just really were getting the crap shot out of us.
At the same time that the lost convoy loaded up and tried to drive to the site of the first downed Black Hawk, a number of the Delta Force operators and Rangers who had taken part in the initial raid were instructed to move on foot 5 or 6 blocks to where the Black Hawk had crashed.
The next thing I know, we were picking up everything and starting to move towards the crash site.
As soon as they started to move, though, they came under intensive fire.
The more experienced Delta operators urged the young Rangers to keep moving.
It didn't feel like the prudent thing to do at the time, you know. But they said, you gotta move, and finally they just went around me, and they went inside the garage area. Just remember hearing a few shots, like bop, 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 bop. One of them poked his head out and said, okay, you guys a good move. It's pretty impressive, because at that point I was scared.
You got down behind what you could get behind and just hope you don't get hit and shoot at what moved towards you. Colette was sitting out in the middle of the street, Tom McClellan, taking down targets.
And there was a little dip in the side of the road, which gave a little bit of cover and some rocks in front of me, which was real handy because it allowed me to lay down really good suppressive fire.
And I heard him yelling, "Grenade, grenade, grenade!" It just, we all kind of hit the ground, and this thing went off, and it went off right out where Colette was.
He started to yell my name. He's like, Colette, Colette, Colette. He's like, are you all right? I'm like, yeah, dude, I'm all right. So I gave him the thumbs up and just continued. But grenades blow up and out. So, luckily.
We're moving down the street now, and then the whole column took a left turn towards the bird, which was back north again. And once that happened, everything slowed down and bogged down, because that's when the volume of fire got Hollywood. And that's when Filmer got hit.
He was one of the D boys. I saw him get hit and just drop.
And it was really strange to hear someone say he's dead, and it wasn't training.
Fillmore's death was a shock. The young Rangers kind of hero worship the Delta guys. They realized that if somebody like him was getting killed or could get killed, that it was unlikely that they were going to get out alive.
You know, I'm seeing guys get hit, and I remember thinking, when am I going to get hit? I know I'm going to get hit.
This pain that you hear in someone's voice when they're hit, and disbelief. You just didn't want to hear anyone scream anymore. That was the big difference between training and the reality.
While the ground troops come under heavy fire, the ground convoy wanders through the maze of narrow streets, struggling to find the crash site.
It became very apparent to me that the directions we were getting weren't working very well. I had this feeling of futility that came over me.
You drive through a block where people are shooting at you from every direction, only to be told, no, we're going the wrong way, turn around, we have to go back the other way, realizing that for no apparently good reason, you're now going to have to drive back through that maelstrom. More guys are going to get killed, maybe you this time.
I just knew we were going to drive around until we were all dead, because people were getting shot left and right in the vehicle convoy, and I was just waiting for my turn.
We'd stop and we'd go, and we'd stop and we'd go, and we're picking up people that are injured along the way, such as Aaron Williamson. Aaron came limping over to the vehicle to get on, and he had a gunshot wound to his leg.
And without a doubt, once we got moving, I'd have much rather been on my feet, because it was a virtual nightmare. Everywhere you went, every alley you went by, you just got pounded. We're the biggest game in town, and everybody's starting to come to play. And I was like, we rolled the dice here. numerous times already today. Probably going to pay the piper again here, you know. Somali guy stepped out, RPG on the shoulder, and I saw him squeeze. I fired at the exact same time. In that fraction of a second, my life kind of just stopped. And I said, well, you know, I guess this is what it's all about, you know. That's why you get the big bucks. But you're gonna eat this. And boom, that thing nailed us. My bell was rung. I mean, I don't know how I stayed conscious.
Aaron's finger or two got cut off from a piece of shrapnel.
I could see the bone on the end of my finger, and then at this point here, I started to fade. Sergeant Weaver's got a hold of me. He was talking to me. I remember this day, you know, remember the Ranger Creed.
And I got Williamson's fingers in my hand saying the Ranger Creed.
The country expects you to do, you know, go further, you know, fight harder and faster than any other soldier, entire Ranger Creed.
A lot of things are said about setting the example for others to follow, but I think the big thing that, especially coming out of Somalia, that you learned from the Ranger Creed, which made it really important, is the fact that we'll never leave a fallen comrade.
Circling far above the battle in Black Hawk Super 6-4, pilot Michael Durant is ordered in to replace the downed Super 6-1.
We orbited the target, trying to make us a difficult target to hit, changing altitude, airspeed.
He only made it through about an orbit and a half when he too was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade in the tail rotor.
Tail rotor actually separated from the aircraft. The aircraft spun so fast. The outside was a complete blur. We're going in hard. I knew we were going to crash.
Less than an hour into the Battle of Mogadishu, pilot Michael Durant's Black Hawk is struck by an RPG.
The call that I remember making is 6-4's been hit. We're going down. We're going in hard.
I saw a Black Hawk landing a village near the fighting place.
They crashed in a little sort of hut village about a good mile, a mile and a half away from where everybody else was already trapped.
Durant and co-pilot Ray Dowdy survived the crash, but both sustained massive injuries.
Probably the only reason I'm here today is that we did hit on the wheel. We still hit hard enough to break my femur on the edge of the seat and then crush the vertebrae in both my spine and, as far as I know, also Ray's spine. I remember regaining consciousness and doing things that are hard to explain. Taking off my watch, taking off my wedding band, setting them both on the center console. No idea why I would do that, but I remember doing it. Fortunately, I had my weapon right there in the cockpit with me, and I found it, picked it up, just assumed that we were going to defend our position until help arrived.
All of the men on the helicopter apparently survived the initial crash, but they were stuck, and there was nobody to come help them out.
Meanwhile, racing the injured Todd Blackburn back to base, Jeff Struker's 3-vehicle convoy is blocked by a mob of advancing Somalis.
There were 1,000 men in that crowd with AK-47s, all of them pointed at us, and this was a very bad situation. The first thing that came to my mind was to tell Paulson on the 50 cal in front of me. I said, Paulson, I want you to put it right over their heads and part this crowd like the Red Sea. Opened up a path, and we drove as fast as possible back to the hangar.
At this point, the battle had grown terribly confusing. Many things were happening at the same time. You had a fierce firefight going on around the first downed Black Hawk. You had a convoy of vehicles that was trying to find its way to that spot and got lost. And then, to top it all off, a second Black Hawk crashed. Michael Durant's helicopter goes down. So at this point, too many things are going on at the same time, and the convoy is getting increasingly lost and cut to ribbons by the now thousands of armed Somalis who have massed in this neighborhood.
Somali warlord Aidid's commanders instruct the Morion to reinforce their lines and prevent escape.
What they do is they set up roadblocks with tires, you know, and they lit them up, and they knew that, you know, that was a waiting ambush.
We had a part of the militia who were responsible for bringing ammunition to the front lines.
They underestimated our power and overestimated their own.
Back at the hangar, the convoy carrying the injured Private Todd Blackburn finally arrives.
It almost looked like there was a state of chaos going on back at the hangar. Guys were running to aircraft. Rotors were turning on aircraft that normally didn't turn. People were running ammunition from vehicle to vehicle. And I had my platoon leader come out and grab me by the arm and tell me, there's been a Black Hawk shot down. You need to get your guys ready to go back out into the city.
We threw together a lot of volunteers, including the cooks from the Ranger base, who grabbed weapons and piled on any available vehicles.
I kind of felt like, you know, this is a no-go. We might all get smoked here. There's a city of people out there wanting to kill us.
Especially after seeing what had happened to Dominic Pillow and what we had just drove through. While I was washing blood out of the back of my vehicle and everybody else was getting ready to fight, I began to pray and I said, God, I can't do this, man. I can't go back out of that city. I'm going to die tonight.
The famous war philosopher Clausewitz said that you can talk anybody into marching into battle. But once they see their guy next to them blown apart, or they get wounded, or they hear the bullets whipping by their ears, and they escape, to get them to go back is the real test.
I had a conversation with one of my soldiers at this point, Brad Thomas. He came and he looked at me in the eye and he said, Soren, I can't go back out there. Man, I'm going to die. And he said, and I got a family at home, I got a wife at home, and I can't go back out into that city. I need to sit this one out. This was the same exact words that I was just thinking 10 minutes ago to myself. I said, Thomas, I'm not going to make you go back out into the city. And I know you're scared. You decide what you're going to do. And I said, you know, the only difference between a hero and a coward is not the fear, but what you do with the fear. And I walked away. And I looked in the rearview mirror of my vehicle and I watched Thomas. And I thought he was going to walk away and go back to the hangar, but he didn't. He grabbed his weapon, got on the back of his Humvee, and got back into his position.
As the volunteer convoy heads back into the firefight, the second crash site is surrounded by Somalis.
When we saw the helicopter get hit by an RPG, we rushed the area.
The Somali mob is about to overrun the second crash site, Michael Durant's crash site. Seeing that this is about to happen, two of the Delta Force operators who had been working as snipers in the Blackhawks, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart, volunteered to go down on the ground themselves to try to hold off this growing Somali mob.
With Somalis swarming the crash site from all directions, the idea seems suicidal. Faced with no other options, command eventually agrees to the sniper's request.
And the first time I remember seeing them, they were standing right there by my cockpit door. The first thing in my mind was, well, basically, it's over. I assumed it was just a matter of time before they put us on an aircraft or a vehicle and got us out of there. The Somalis were trying to get in. They were coming in one at a time, two at a time, from various points around the aircraft, and we were shooting occasionally to just sort of keep them at bay. And they worked effectively for some time. Somewhere in that sequence, what I believe now is Gary Gordon was shot on the left side of the aircraft. I didn't see him, and he made a statement about getting hit, and that was it. And I never saw him again. Randy comes back around the nose, walked up to the nose of the aircraft and made a call on the survival radio. At that point, I can say for sure only that Randy Shugart was probably the only individual on the left side of the aircraft, which is where they all approached from. And it was simply a matter of time before he went down. And he did, and the shooting all stopped. I was out of ammunition. I accepted the fact that I was about to die. Placed the weapon that I had across my chest, put my hands on it, and looked up at the sky. And they overran the site. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. To hear the crowd coming, to hear the screaming and the throwing of debris and the chaos is beyond my ability to describe.
I saw the pilot. He's from the Rangers. He had cuts all over his body, but I imagined death would heal all.
They were pulling on my boots and they were pulling on my survival vest, and the only things that I had on me to be used to identify me were my identification tags or dog tags. And the individual ripped those off from around my neck, and he looked at me and just as aggressively and angrily as you could say it, "Ranger, Ranger, you die, Somalia."
They beat to death or dismembered the crew members who were either dead or not quite dead already. They began tearing apart the Black Hawk helicopter. It was a victory for them. Being able to kill and dismember the bodies of these American soldiers was just the mob's way of expressing this terrific anger that they felt. It's amazing under those circumstances that Michael Durant's life was spared.
One individual took control of the situation by firing a weapon up into the air. He saw value in me as a live prisoner versus allowing the mob to beat me to death.
Though Michael Durant is spared the unthinkable, his fellow soldiers are not.
I saw some U.S. soldiers dying, and the people are jogging on the dusty streets in Mogadishu.
It's hard for me to imagine how anybody could be that angry and could be that violent, because these are things that, to me, go beyond humankind.
They killed our people, so we were angry.
They killed hundreds of Somalis. What does it matter if 1 or 2 Americans are dragged on the ground? It did not bother me at all.
As the mob takes Michael Durant into captivity, the vehicle convoys begin to fight their way out of the city.
And a decision was made, with all the confusion going on, that the thing to do was just to get back to the Ranger base and figure out what the next move would be.
I remember pulling in and feeling a sense of, not elation, but just relief at being back. It's like this great weight had been lifted off. It's like, man, we made it back here.
Despite making it back alive, the men realize that their friends are still out there, and that they'll be going back out.
You don't have any choice. You have to go back out there.
As the vehicle convoys fight their way out of Mogadishu, 99 soldiers remain trapped in an enraged city.
I remember shoving my hands and just feeling mush and blood coming out. And Stormborn jumped on me, dragged me back to the corner. I was kicking and trying to help him. That's when Tim Wilkinson came over, and he just started to go to work. He was right there, kind of reassuring me, "You're gonna be okay." But all I could think about was, man, you know, that's just what they tell the guys when they're missing both their legs. And, you know, and they're surely gonna die.
In order to retrieve the intravenous fluids needed to sustain the life of Carlos Rodriguez, medic Tim Wilkinson has to cross back through an intersection the Rangers call the Funnel of Death.
Tim Wilkinson had to run back across the street through all the heavy fire again in order to retrieve the IV bags, and then a third time cross the street. And one of the Rangers watching all this just was moved to utter to himself, "God loves medics," because Tim Wilkinson made it across a third time and was able to start an IV and probably save Carlos Rodriguez's life.
What, 8 years have passed, and I wanted to thank him.
As the Rangers moved through the streets, when the fire became intense, they would break down doorways and take cover inside.
Some American soldiers broke into the house of my friend called Amina, living nearby, and they took over her house.
The force that moved out on foot to get to the first Black Hawk crash site ended up strung out over about a 2-block area on a sort of a rough L shape.
So we pushed into this courtyard of that building there, and that's pretty much where my group held up most of the night.
The commanders back at the base were working furiously to assemble a huge convoy. It was literally a mile long, thinking that if they had to go back out into the city, they were going to go in such force that there was really no way they were not going to succeed.
This third trip would be with armored vehicles, and it eventually would become a multinational force that would go out into the city a third time and get everybody that was left.
By now, pilot Michael Durant is in Aidid's captivity, chained to the floor with a broken back and a compound fracture of his femur.
Somebody came in, didn't even have the guts to open the door and come in and look me in the eye. I mean, just stuck a weapon through the opening in the door and fired a round. The round didn't hit me directly. It hit the floor of the room first, and then it impacted in my left shoulder.
Back at the crash site, Corporal Jamie Smith fights for his life.
It was apparent just moments after Jamie was shot that his femoral artery had been severed because blood was spurting out at a very dramatic rate. Kurt Schmid, who was the medic who worked on him, realized that if he gave him morphine, it would slow down his heart rate. And given Jamie's rapid loss of blood, slowing down his heart rate would be life-threatening. So he was forced to probe Jamie's wound in an effort to find the artery and clamp it shut without any kind of painkillers.
With Jamie Smith bleeding, the massive rescue convoy continues to assemble at an excruciatingly slow pace.
We got a call over the radio that Corporal Smith, who had been seriously wounded, his condition was deteriorating. He needed blood. He needed to extract immediately.
It was a very frustrating experience because we were ready to roll back out there, lay waste to whoever stood in the way, pick up our people, and come home.
They recruited Pakistani and Malaysian units to contribute tanks and armored personnel carriers to this effort. But the process of coordinating, working in 3 different languages, getting all this pulled together, took hours.
And then the call came in over the radio, hey, that's it. Smith he lost the fight.
Jamie Smith's death came quietly after sunset. He talked to the medic about his family, left him with last words for his family, and quietly expired.
While one more American was dying, the Somalis were dying by the hundreds.
The worst thing I saw was 7 children brought in on a wheelbarrow. Many legs and arms were amputated. People were screaming on the floor. It was like doomsday. I thought all of Mogadishu had died.
I wouldn't say that the American soldiers intentionally killed women and children, but many civilians died in the crossfire. My own brother was killed in the fight.
In the heat of the moment, I'm talking about when you're fighting for your life, you have to choose to kill other people. You have to deliberately look for the man who's trying to kill you, and you have to kill that man. And you can't reflect on the right or wrong of that.
No American soldier is really prepared to go in and see a 12-year-old kid who can't put an AK-47 against his shoulder, so he's got it underneath his arm firing. That's a new paradigm for us.
You can reflect back on the morality of what you have done, but you have to be careful pulling it out of context. You can't judge this man and say this man has killed people, maybe even women or children with weapons, and say he's a bad man.
As the night wears on, 99 men entrenched around the crash site begin to reflect on their own mortality.
At some point, the adrenaline goes. And I felt it. I felt it sitting there in that dark, nasty place. And I was like, God, I'm tired. Many of us made peace with the fact that if we die here, we're going to die here. And there's really not a whole lot we can do about it.
God, I don't want to die in this little hole. It was a dirty, nasty little living room in somebody's house in Somalia.
What spared them being overrun were the scores of gun runs made by the Little Bird pilots who would come screaming in literally below the roofline to take shooting runs.
One of the Little Birds came in and did a run right over our head. And, you know, we actually had casings from the miniguns falling on our helmets.
Those guys are the greatest pilots I've ever seen, so it was definitely a good thing to have.
Whenever any group of Somalis would amass in sufficient number, they would target them, which they had the effect, the little birds, of keeping any large numbers of Somalis who might have been able to overrun the location backed off, like 2 or 3 blocks away.
They were our heroes. You know, without a doubt in my heart, those guys hadn't gotten up there and flown their asses off all night long, that you know, I wouldn't be here talking to you.
As the Night Stalkers keep the Somalis at bay, the assembly of the massive rescue convoy inches towards completion.
Between midnight and 1 o'clock, we finally launched this convoy, this multinational convoy, from the Newport area to the target building. The vehicles turned the corner to National Street, and it was like the 4th of July. Everything on National Street immediately converged on that tank. Every vehicle in front of me just immediately started dumping all of their ammunition.
As the giant convoy rumbles through the city, captured pilot Michael Durant remains chained in captivity.
I thought it was a rescue. I assumed that one of the helicopters had tracked me somehow, and there was a rescue coming because there was an enormous amount of gunfire, and I thought, okay, one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to break into this compound and rescue me, or the Somalis are going to kill me. The convoy kept getting closer and closer and louder, and then it just passed on by. And it was a big emotional letdown. I mean, obviously, it's not a rescue attempt. No, nobody knows where I am, and I'm stuck here.
The soldiers around the crash site also hear the convoy coming.
The convoys just kept trying to get to us all night, and you know, we'd hear a lot of gunfire in the distance.
Of course, to them it was the most reassuring sound and image in the world, because it meant, you know, they could track the progress of the men who were coming to rescue them. But given the volume of fire, they also got worried that they were going to become casualties of the convoy coming in.
To prevent friendly fire, the soldiers put plastic chem lights in the streets and wait for the rescue to arrive.
Our platoon sergeant came out and said, all right, we're putting all the wounded onto the armored personnel carriers, and then we're going to get out of here. I said, that's great. I'm one of those wounded. Let's go.
Those that were dead were stacked on top of the vehicles because there was no room for them, literally no room inside. And those that were wounded were packed inside.
I mean, this was a great packing job that they did in there. We were packed in there pretty good. We were sitting there for a while, it seemed like for a long while, before, you know, we weren't moving.
Kind of turned around over my shoulder, and I said to the driver, hey, we need to go. Let's get out of here. And he said, no, we stay. And then I started getting a little irate with him. I said, no, you don't understand. We need to get the hell out of here because we're a huge target and we're going to die.
Many of the soldiers were unaware that the lifeless body of pilot Cliff Walcott was still trapped in the wreckage of the downed Black Hawk.
There was no way I was going to leave an American soldier behind. And the fact Cliff was a personal friend of mine.
His body had gotten crumpled into the front of the helicopter when it crashed, because it crashed on its left front side. There was no easy way to extricate his body from the wreckage.
I didn't want to get stuck there once the sun came up, but we were in fact there after daylight, much to my chagrin. Finally got Cliff out.
When the word finally came that we were ready to go, it was close to 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun was breaking over the horizon, and every moment that the sun came up, the enemy fire became more and more intense.
Jeff Strucker occupies the last American Humvee to evacuate Mogadishu. The plan is to evacuate all remaining soldiers 1 mile north to a soccer stadium controlled by Pakistani peacekeepers.
I told Paulson to turn your gun to the rear and get ready to return fire at anything coming from our rear. Not more than a minute down the road, Paulson yelled down to me, hey, Sergeant, I got some guys running down the road after us. I said, well, Paulson, shoot them up, fire them up. And he said, no, those look like our guys. I looked behind me in the rearview mirror and I saw about a dozen people running down the road. And running at a full speed, they had their weapons up, and clearly it looked like our guys. And I thought to myself, how can this be? We've accounted for everybody. We got everybody on the vehicles. How can this be our guys?
The idea was we were going to follow behind the armored vehicles and use them as cover as we crossed the street. Well, those dudes weren't having any of that. They were hitting the gas, and they took off. He's like, there goes our ride.
And I thought, my God, they're having these guys run out of here. This is ridiculous.
Here's a great plan. We're going to run out of here. Why didn't I do that 12 hours ago?
They just took off at top speed to drive out of the city and ended up stranding a lot of the Rangers and Delta Force operators who had fought through this entire battle.
It's going to be known as the Mogadishu Mile.
So they were literally forced what they call the Mogadishu Mile. They ran out of the city, once again under increasing fire from all directions.
You know, guys were firing from the hip. We're firing on the run.
At this point, I think I had maybe half a magazine of ammo left, so I was really just sort of running along and just hoping I looked scary enough that no one would shoot at me.
The only thing left between 99 men and the salvation of an old soccer stadium is one long, lonely mile.
You could feel in the air. It was just this seething sensation of people wanting to kill you.
Each member of Task Force Ranger would survive the Mogadishu Mile and find themselves on the center of a bizarre stage.
All of the men who had made it out of the city, along with the wounded and dead, were evacuated to this soccer stadium. A brutal gathering of everyone so that everyone could kind of visually see the consequences of this battle.
We had our dead comrades laid out there on one area and all the wounded in another area. It's an impression indelibly burned in my mind. It's just so surreal.
The scene was just overwhelming. There were bodies everywhere, and more than we could even count.
I just started crying. I think because I knew it was all done, you know, and it was just whatever energy that we had all mustered up inside of ourselves was now just starting to come out.
Just I remember one guy come up to me, he's just crying face is full of tears, and then just starts rattling off names. So-and-so got killed, Pilla got killed, Joyce got killed, Ruiz is dead, Cavaco's dead, Kowalewski's dead, Durant is captured. I mean, it's just, you know, it's just, this is not how it's supposed to happen.
And the first words out of my mouth, you know, I was like, well, you know, where the hell is Schmitty? You know, why hasn't he come over here and seen me? And, you know, Sergeant Elliott, Charlie, you know, he just started crying, you know, and that's when I found that, you know, how that Jamie had been killed. You know, everything in me just stopped. Now I'm throwing up the flag here, you know, that's not true. But it was.
After being evacuated back to the base, Task Force Ranger watches the post-mortem of their battle on CNN.
We knew we were missing guys, and actually that morning was when the first footage of Americans being desecrated by Somalis showed up.
And now there's a picture of a U.S. soldier being dragged around the streets of Mogadishu, you know, like a dead animal.
The worst thing that anybody could have seen, especially right after that, because we knew that there were still people out there, and we didn't know exactly where they were at, and all we wanted to do was get them back.
Yeah, we had soldiers unaccounted for. So the first thing we did, we got back and cleaned our weapons and reloaded our magazines.
It wasn't like I wasn't scared, but I wanted to go back out there and finish what we had to do.
I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for the Delta element there. Those are our brothers out there. We didn't know if they were alive or dead, and had to go get them.
And I could have gone back out there without any sleep. If we knew then Durant's disposition, where he was, that he was alive, being kept, and we could have gone and actually launched a mission, we would have got him.
Not more than a few miles from Task Force Ranger, Michael Durant remains a captive of the warlord Aidid.
In the first day of Michael Durant's captivity, a television crew of Somalis arrived to videotape a statement from him. And Durant answered a number of questions as artfully as he could without trying to give away any information or without betraying his own cause.
They wanted me to say that we were not supposed to be there in a military show of force and we were killing innocent people. I mean, that's what they wanted me to say. I didn't believe that. And I was absolutely not going to say that no matter what.
How related is this operation? a soldier, I have to do what I'm told. Even if you kill the people innocent. Innocent people being killed is not good.
I didn't ever say anything that condemned our presence there or that I regret saying.
Moments after the interview, Michael Durant is thrown into the back of a truck and transferred to a final location.
They turned him over to the care of a man named Abdullahi Hassan, who was known as Firimbi.
General Adid handed me the care of the American pilot Michael Durant, whose airplane was knocked down. Adid asked me to take care of him and hide him from the population who wanted to kill him.
It is my understanding that my safeguard and my well-being were put in his hands.
When I first saw him, he was in total misery. He looked very much like a hopeless man. He was suffering great pain, and I thought he would die.
So he spent the next 10 days basically trying his best to take care of Michael Durant and also to convince Durant that even though he'd been beaten nearly to death, he'd been shot in captivity, that the Somalis were actually very humane and that he wasn't going to be mistreated.
Michael Durant has been very concerned with praying and reading a Holy Bible that was brought to him by the Red Cross.
I knew that there was one thing that, at least I felt like there was one thing that the Somalis respected, and that was religion.
Well, Firimbi, his jailer, noticed that Durant was spending large amounts of time, taking notes and huddling over his Bible, and assumed that he was a very religious man.
I prayed. I wanted to get out of there. I prayed for my family. I prayed for my friends. I did all those things. But what Firimbi doesn't know is that I was keeping a journal of what was going on in that Bible, because I knew if they let me leave with something, it would be that Bible.
He used the Bible as his diary, and he began making entries in the margins of the Bible with little code words, which was basically his way of keeping track of everything that had happened to him from the moment he had crashed.
And it worked like a charm. I mean, I don't believe they ever knew I was doing it. That, to me, was probably the biggest emotional boost for me throughout. I was doing something, I was defying their authority, and they never knew I was doing it, and it turned out to be very helpful in the end.
And the two men formed a kind of friendship of necessity in the 10 days that they were confined together.
I would tell the American people that Michael Durant has been a very brave man among their people.
He did some things to care for me personally that I think went beyond what I would have expected for a captain. But I tried to never let it get the better of me, knowing that even so, this guy is still the enemy. If a rescue did come, I can guarantee you Firimbi's orders were to shoot me. They had to be. I mean, why would they want a successful rescue? And I thought, if these people like me, they may still shoot me, but it may take them a second to think about it before they pull that trigger. And that might just be enough time for that door to get knocked down and for me to get out of here.
While Durant remains in the custody of Firimbi, his fellow Night Stalker pilots are never far away.
American helicopters would fly over this place and tell him messages of hope. They were his friends that were up there.
Extremely emotional event. Hearing a very good friend of mine's voice over those airborne loudspeakers, "We won't leave you behind." And I knew they wouldn't.
While the men of Task Force Ranger watch images of death in Mogadishu, Mark Bowden and the rest of America watch the same images at home.
Very few Americans were aware of what was going on in Somalia, and were certainly unaware, as even the president was, that Task Force Ranger had embarked on this very dangerous mission the night before.
The Clinton administration responds with a show of force, with thousands of additional troops and an armada of warships parked off the coast of Somalia. Special Envoy Bob Oakley is dispatched with a simple message for Aidid: release Durant, or else.
There have been too many Somalis killed already. let's not go that route. And they came back with a message saying, okay, Adid's agreed to release it. And it was certainly a great relief to us.
Prior to his airlift out of Mogadishu, Durant is reunited with Task Force Ranger.
Some of my best friends in my life carried that litter through that line up to the tail of the aircraft. And when we got there, everybody had a toast. We toasted the fallen members of our task force and paid tribute to their sacrifices. I did feel joy in actually leaving, and obviously remorse over the fact that we lost so many of our friends and comrades.
The show of force by the Clinton administration is simply that. A decision had been made to cease all operations in Somalia and make a gradual withdrawal.
Well, the images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu were like bombs going off in the United States.
No one's prepared to see Americans lose their lives. And when it hit hard on the TV screen, American bodies being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, the political reaction was swift and overwhelming. Let's get out.
In all, 18 American soldiers were killed in the battle, 73 wounded. Estimates on the Somali side range from 1,000 to over 10,000 killed.
General Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made the remark to me that in Vietnam, losing 18 men on an engagement wouldn't even have been significant enough to hold a press conference. But what he well knew was those 18 American soldiers would weigh very heavily in the United States in forming, political decision and public decision. And those deaths in Somalia ended the mission, and so in that sense, they won the battle, but they lost the war.
Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for their heroic attempts to save the lives of Michael Durant and the crew of Black Hawk Super 6-4. Todd Blackburn would recover from his injuries. Others who survived the battle would be decorated for valor and extraordinary bravery in combat. Each would be home within 1 month.
Had any of us had our way, we would have stayed there. We would have stayed there and turned around and gone in the very next day with reinforcements and just leveled the city until nothing was standing except for freaking Adid hiding under a table with no city around him. We got you. We accomplished our mission. We weren't allowed to do that.
A lot of people who talk to me about this battle have asked me if the American soldiers who fought in it are bitter. And they're not bitter about having been there or about the mission or about their commanders. They're bitter about the fact that the day after this battle, their mission was called off.
And don't get me wrong, we're all happy to go home. Somalia is, there's a reason there are no timeshares in Somalia. It's an awful place. But you're talking about a lot of very highly trained Type A personalities who had a job to do and were prevented from doing it.
We stopped. We ceased all operations and turned what was a hard-fought, brutal victory into an absolute defeat by handing over the advantage to the Somalis and giving them now the very victory that we had fought all day for.
And if you're going to do that, then why send us in the first place? Why lose those lives if you're not serious about it?
As the commander-in-chief and the leader of this country, which is always the same person, you absolutely have the obligation to be as strong as the people you send out to die.
Some people have criticized President Clinton, saying if he'd acted like a commander-in-chief and said, it's my job to decide what to do, we're going to fight, we're not going to withdraw. Say my contacts in Congress who were present at this leadership meeting said it wouldn't have worked. Congress would have overwhelmingly passed a resolution saying get out within 1 month.
Isa Muhammad could not have anticipated the impact his images would have on American history.
I have a camera and I shoot whatever looks important.
Those images are the single defining image of Mogadishu. That image completely changed not just the operations in Somalia, but American foreign policy.
And there are many people in the military who feel that those images which were aired again and again on CNN and other networks should not be shown to the American people. As painful as that is, though, I disagree. I think that journalism plays an extremely important role in a democracy. It was important for Americans to know what was going on over in Somalia, in Mogadishu.
To show the people all over the world what's happening in Somalia.
What that says to me is war is horrible and war is terrible, and you don't undertake war lightly.
It's not a glorious thing. It's a terrible thing. People die in terrible ways.
In Somalia, they were prepared to fight and they were prepared to die. The one part that I was not prepared for is how willing they were to die and to send their wives, their daughters, their sons to die.
The events in Somalia really served to focus better. Why do we have a military? What do we do with it? And how carefully do we analyze the criteria for deployment?
In the aftermath of Somalia, the Clinton administration decided against sending U.S. troops to intervene in the Rwanda genocide. The war in Kosovo was fought from 35,000 feet without a single casualty.
It's the potency of the graphic image which can now single-handedly change, in this case, the foreign policy of the most powerful nation in the world.
Winston Churchill said, we'll fight them in the air, we'll fight them on the water, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them from the cliffs, we'll never, never surrender. Well, this episode sent the message that, you know, we'll fight them on the beaches and we'll fight them on the hills, but if they kill a few of our soldiers, we'll give up and go away.
We have defeated the Americans. We are victorious.
The Battle of Mogadishu, though, wasn't a victory in any larger sense for anyone. The Somalis celebrated as a national holiday insofar as the clan of Mohammed Farah Aidid can be considered the nation because they managed to scare off the big bad United States.
Now let the Americans go away with their weapons and their solutions.
But what they actually succeeded in doing was driving away the international commitment to feeding and establishing a stable government and society in Somalia.
When they pulled out, the famine and the insecurity came right back.
Aidid and his lieutenants were free to continue their clan warfare. International aid groups fled Mogadishu due to rampant insecurity. 8 years after the battle, America has no diplomatic relations with Somalia. And now, the story of the warlord Aidid has come full circle. Upon the death of his father in 1995, Hussein Aidid gave up his life in California.
Hussein came back to Mogadishu to basically take over his father's role as the head of the clan.
The same son who once served with U.S. Marines in Somalia became the new warlord of the Habergider clan.
My goal was to be just like my father.
As a result, they've devolved into 7 or 8 more years of civil war. The country is in shambles. There's very little hope in the near future that it's going to be able to turn itself around.
Though Somalia hasn't changed, the American soldiers who fought there will never be the same.
Everybody takes with them some sort of casualty of that battle.
Changes you. I'm not the same person I was before. Everyone who knows me will tell you, I'm not even near the same person I was before.
I mean, I remember crying every day for months, just out of the blue. You know, and just certain songs do it, certain thoughts, the remorse, the loss of friends, the patriotism, the joy of being released.
You know, I still carry the physical scar where I got wounded there from that. I don't need the reminder. I'll never forget that. You never get over losing a friend. You just don't. No one does.
One of the things that struck me working on the story of Black Hawk Down was the tremendous courage and nobility of these young men. None of those young men who were trapped on the streets of Mogadishu, being shot at, wounded, and killed, had any part in the decision that put them there. You know, they were there representing you and me as American citizens.
I've told Mark Bowden, I thought that's what his book was. The most single valuable point of his book for us was that it has been deemed important enough that someone wants to hear that story.
They were doing their duty as American citizens. And I think that for us as a country to ignore that level of courage and sacrifice is a real disservice to everybody in uniform, in particular to these men who fought in Mogadishu. One of my strongest satisfactions in writing this book has been to preserve the memory of what happened there and to give these men who fought there some measure of respect and acknowledgement for what they went through.